President Trump promised a major statement on Wednesday about his trip to Asia, but that's not exactly what we got. Here's how the president opened his remarks.
Last night, I returned from a historic 12-day trip to Asia. This journey took us to 5 nations to meet with dozens of foreign leaders, participate in 3 formal state visits, and attend 3 key regional summits. When we are confident in ourselves, our strength, our flag, our history, our values, other nations are confident in us. And when we treat our citizens with the respect they deserve, other countries treat America with the respect that our country so richly deserves.
Matthew Kroenig is a professor at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also the author of the new book, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, and he joins me now from Washington. So the president spent Wednesday touting the success of this trip, but some say he left Asia empty-handed with no major diplomatic concessions. Is it too early to gauge how successful the trip was?
I think it is too early. You know, often the points of these trips is not to get some kind of major policy breakthrough. Rather, it's more symbolic. It shows that the United States cares about Asia. The president's time is valuable, so the fact that he was willing to go signifies that this is a priority. It also allows the president to form personal relationships with other world leaders. And also the president travels with a large staff who are able to conduct more working-level meetings with their counterparts. So often any substantive breakthroughs happen well before the trip even takes place. So again, I think more symbolic than substantive.
You mentioned the personal relationships. There are some critics out there that said that his dealings with the Chinese president, the Russian president, that basically the president got rolled by those guys, and that long-term it actually wasn't good. It was more to stroke the president's ego. What's your take on that, on those critics?
The president has been somewhat deferential to Xi and his public statements. What's interesting, though, is that the U.S. policy toward China behind the scenes has actually been quite a bit tougher. The United States Treasury Department has put secondary sanctions in place on Chinese banks doing business with North Korea, and there's the threat of more to come to increase the economic pressure on both China and North Korea. And I think that's going to be necessary to put real pressure on North Korea. So there's something of a difference there between the president's statements, which are pretty sympathetic towards Xi, and the behind-the-scenes policy, which seems to be a little bit tougher.
Is there anything you wanted to see done on this trip that the president didn't do?
Again, I think a lot of the purpose of the trip is symbolic, showing that the president cares about Asia. Early on, there were some questions about whether the president was going to go to an important summit with Southeast Asian nations, and there were some fears that he might not do that. In the end, he decided to extend the trip and attend that summit as well. So I think that was an important step to show that Southeast Asia is also a priority. The United States is not just fixated on North Korea. But again, I wasn't looking for real substantive breakthroughs. It was more of a symbolic trip, I think, and in that sense, for the most part, the goal was accomplished.
President Trump said Chinese President Xi agreed that a, quote, freeze-for-freeze agreement was not acceptable. What is that, and what do you make of that statement on Wednesday?
Yes. So this is an idea that was put forward by the Chinese and the Russians a couple of months ago. And basically they said that perhaps the North Koreans would agree to freeze their nuclear and missile program, not conduct more tests, not build more nuclear weapons, in exchange for the United States and South Korea freezing their military exercises on the Korean peninsula. There were 2 problems with this from the get-go, though. One is the North Koreans said, we're not interested. The North Koreans said, we're going to continue to expand our nuclear program. We're not interested in a freeze. But also this is a problem for the United States and for South Korea, because a freeze-for-a-freeze agreement would essentially mean leaving North Korea's nuclear weapons in place and essentially legitimating their nuclear program, saying we're going to freeze the program, but we'll let them keep what they have. And U.S. and South Korean policy for many years has been that North Korea must denuclearize. And so if we can take the president at his word, it seems that Xi has given up on this goal of a freeze for a freeze, at least in the short term, and is on board with the idea of denuclearization as the continued goal.
After holding back on controversial tweets for a bit during his trip, he did tweet about North Korean leader Kim Jong-un while he was overseas. He sort of called the North Korean leader, quote, short and fat. But Mr. Trump has appeared to soften his stance toward the North Korean regime, saying he hoped Pyongyang would come to the table. How do you think that tweet was received?
Well, it's an unorthodox tweet for sure, not the kind of thing we're used to seeing from U.S. presidents. I think the personal insults back and forth are probably not helpful. But, you know, the Trump administration, U.S. policy on North Korea is, the label is maximum pressure and engagement. So the idea is to increase the pressure on North Korea in the short term with sanctions, military, political pressure, but with the goal of eventually having engagement and bringing them to the table and negotiating. So, you know, the end of the tweet you mentioned, Trump talked about how maybe one day he and Kim Jong-un will be friends. Again, an unusual kind of phrasing, but perhaps signaling the possibility of future engagement if North Korea is willing to come to the table to discuss denuclearization.
Matthew Kroenig, thanks for your insight.
My pleasure.